At 3:14 p.m. local time, the Caribbean looked exactly the way mariners prefer to see it. Calm water, clear visibility, steady wind, and nothing that seemed unusual. The American aircraft carrier was on a standard transit, holding a steady course and speed through international waters. Flight activity was limited. There were no drills, no emergency signals, just another controlled passage through a region where the U.S. Navy had operated for many years. Then the radar picture inside the carrier's Combat Information Center began to shift. 7 surface contacts appeared almost at once. They were not grouped together, and they were not moving randomly. Each one approached from a different direction, carefully spaced to create a broad arc across the carrier's projected route. Their speeds began to rise, gradually at first, then more noticeably. This did not look like ordinary commercial traffic. Within seconds, the watch team started identifying the contacts. Hull shapes, radar returns, propulsion signatures. Every indicator pointed to Venezuelan naval vessels. On paper, they were lightly armed patrol ships, but their movement suggested clear purpose. There were no distress calls, no radio contact, and no effort to identify themselves. The bridge remained quiet. There was no panic, no shouted orders, only calm confirmations as the officer of the deck acknowledged updates from CIC. Bearings, distance, estimated closest approach, everything was recorded. Every moment mattered, and every decision had to stand up not only tactically, but legally. The carrier did not change course. That decision alone carried weight. In modern naval operations, the first move often shapes everything that follows. Turning away can signal uncertainty. Changing speed can create room for misjudgment. But maintaining course and maintaining discipline forces the other side to reveal its intentions. And over the next few minutes, that is exactly what happened. 2 of the 7 Venezuelan ships accelerated sharply, pushing well beyond normal cruising speed. Another adjusted course, trimming the distance to the carrier's starboard quarter. The formation was tightening, not by chance, but with obvious coordination. From above, it would have looked like measured pressure being applied from several angles at once, a classic gray zone tactic meant to intimidate without openly crossing the line. They were counting on hesitation. What they were closing in on, however, was not an isolated ship. It was a U.S. aircraft carrier, built to handle pressure without reacting emotionally to it. Every movement around it was being tracked not by a single radar, but by a layered network of sensors, aircraft, and satellites, reaching far beyond the horizon. Even so, the carrier stayed quiet. No warnings were transmitted, no escort ships rushed forward. The flight deck remained orderly. Sailors continued their work with the kind of composure that comes only from training for situations exactly like this. The message was understated, but impossible to miss. We see you, and nothing about this has caught us off guard. At that moment, the Venezuelan commanders may have believed they were in control. 7 hulls against 1, approaching from multiple directions at reduced distance. In many situations, that posture would force some kind of reaction, whether a course correction or at least a radio exchange. But no reaction came, and that is where the real mistake began. Because the longer the carrier stayed on its line, the more information it gathered. Engine acoustics, radar activity, maneuver habits, response timing, command rhythm. Every decision those 7 ships made was being logged, time-stamped, and assessed in real time. What looked like pressure was, in fact, exposure. This still was not an open confrontation. No alarms were sounding, and no one was racing to battle stations. But the tone had changed. The Venezuelan ships were no longer simply making their presence known. They were committing themselves to a sequence of actions that would be difficult to explain away later. They believed they were moving in on a symbol of power. What they did not realize was that they were stepping into a system built to let an opponent make the first mistake quietly, professionally, and in a way that would only become clear once the moment had already passed. By 3:21 p.m., the geometry of the encounter was no longer theoretical. The 7 Venezuelan vessels had closed to the point where every bearing adjustment mattered. On the carrier's tactical displays, their tracks no longer formed a distant arc. Now they represented a tightening, converging problem. Estimated closest approaches were updating in real time, growing smaller with each new sweep. Still, the carrier held steady. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere remained controlled and precise. Radar operators reported speed changes. Electronic warfare specialists monitored emissions. Intelligence personnel compared incoming data with known Venezuelan naval profiles. There was no drama and no rush, only disciplined observation, the kind that turns confusion into a clear picture. What stood out most was not simple aggression, but coordination. 2 Venezuelan ships altered course within seconds of each other, matching speed as though responding to the same command cue. Another intentionally stayed back, preserving the spacing. This was not random harassment. It was a prepared maneuver designed to create pressure without crossing the legal threshold that would justify a direct response. No targeting systems were activated. No fire control radars lit up. That detail mattered. Under international rules of engagement, intent is everything. The Venezuelan ships were careful not to do anything that would immediately force the situation to escalate beyond their control. But intent is not judged by equipment alone. It is revealed through movement, timing, and proximity, and all three were moving in the same direction. On the bridge, the carrier's captain studied the plot in silence. There was nothing to add. The choices were already obvious. Changing course might have eased the tension, but it also would have handed over control of the story. Issuing a radio warning might have seemed reasonable, yet it would have given the approaching ships exactly what they were after: acknowledgement. So the carrier chose neither. Instead, another layer of capability quietly came online. Long-range optics turned toward the nearest contacts. Infrared sensors began following the heat signatures of engines being pushed harder than normal patrol speed would require. Electronic support systems captured every radar sweep and every burst of communication exchanged among the Venezuelan ships. This was escalation, but not the kind that draws headlines. From the deck, nothing looked different. The sea remained calm. The carrier's wake stayed straight and undisturbed. Sailors topside could now make out the distant silhouettes clearly, gray hulls slicing through the water and growing larger with each passing minute. Yet there was no outward sign of strain, no rushing feet, no shouted commands. That calm was intentional. At 3:26 p.m., the nearest Venezuelan ship crossed an important threshold, close enough that safe maneuvering space could disappear in an instant. At that distance, any sudden turn would not just seem aggressive, it would be dangerous. The risk of collision rose sharply. One mistake from either side could trigger an incident that neither would be able to contain. That was when the carrier's air wing entered the picture. Not with noise, not with spectacle, with presence. A helicopter crew received a quiet assignment. Not to warn, not to threaten, to observe, to document, and to make that observation just visible enough to be understood. Beyond the horizon, aircraft were already in position, expanding the carrier's awareness far beyond what the surface picture alone could show. What Venezuelan commanders saw as 7 ships pressing inward was, in reality, only a small part of a much larger operational environment. The pressure they were applying moved in one direction. The pressure surrounding them did not. Every minute that passed without a visible American response increased the burden on the Venezuelan side. Pulling away now would invite difficult questions. Continuing forward risked crossing a line that could not simply be erased afterward. Their own coordination had locked them into motion, and that same momentum was now limiting their options. Still, the carrier did not flinch. No course correction, no speed change, no radio call. Only steady movement and silent collection of evidence. In naval encounters, escalation often grows out of emotion, fear, pride, or misjudgment. But this situation was different. One side was trying to force a response. The other was letting the moment unfold, fully aware that time rewards discipline. By the time the Venezuelan ships understood that their presence was not controlling the encounter, but defining it, the balance had already begun to change. They were no longer testing the carrier. They were exposing themselves to it. At 3:32 p.m., the encounter reached its turning point. The 7 Venezuelan warships were now close enough that their individual movements could be followed with the naked eye from the carrier's bridge. Gray hulls moved across converging lines, their wakes crossing like vectors drawn across a tactical display. Distance was no longer just a number on a screen. It was now measured in minutes and in risk. This is usually the stage where these confrontations break in one of 2 directions. Either someone backs off or someone pushes further. The U.S. carrier chose neither. Instead, a new factor entered the scene quietly, deliberately, and with exact control. A helicopter lifted from the flight deck without drama. There was no theatrical launch, no sudden burst of visible activity, only a smooth climb into the air before it banked low across the water and accelerated toward the nearest Venezuelan ship. Its mission was not intimidation, it was precision. Using nose-mounted sensors, the crew gained a clear view of the approaching vessels. High-resolution optics focused on bridge windows, deck activity, and navigation equipment. Infrared systems tracked engine heat, confirming that the ships had been maintaining high-speed movement. Every image was recorded, every second was time-stamped, every maneuver was preserved. The Venezuelan ships noticed immediately. A helicopter changes everything. Surface ships rely on distance and momentum. Aircraft reduce both in an instant. Venezuelan commanders now understood that they were not confronting a single hull, but a layered network able to detect, document, and respond far faster than anything they had brought into the situation. Even then, the carrier said nothing. No warning broadcasts, no flashing signals. The helicopter held a controlled altitude and careful distance, close enough to leave no doubt, far enough to avoid looking openly provocative. its presence delivered a message of awareness, not aggression. Then came the moment that mattered most. A green laser briefly illuminated the forward superstructure of the lead Venezuelan ship. It was not a weapon and not a targeting lock, but it was precise, unmistakable, and impossible to misunderstand. In the shared language of modern naval encounters, it meant one thing: you are being watched and there is no uncertainty anymore. Within seconds, activity aboard the Venezuelan ships changed. Sailors shifted position. A group gathered near the forward gun mount broke apart. On the bridge, silhouettes leaned forward, binoculars raised toward the sky and then toward the carrier. And for the first time since the encounter began, one of the 7 ships hesitated. Its speed fell by several knots. The change was slight, almost invisible to the eye, but on radar it stood out immediately. Another ship altered course by just a few degrees, enough to increase its closest point of approach and create a little more space. The tight geometry that had defined their maneuver began to unravel. The formation loosened and the pressure they had built started to fade. Overhead, the helicopter maintained its steady orbit, unhurried and precise. Sensors continued their work and live video streamed back to the carrier in real time. What had begun as a gray zone move was now fully documented, backed by evidence that could be reviewed far beyond the Caribbean if necessary. This was the turning point. By moving in close without the authority to escalate further, the Venezuelan ships had effectively fixed themselves in place, tactically, legally, and politically. Any move forward risked unsafe navigation. Any sudden maneuver could be interpreted as hostile, yet pulling away would signal that the effort had failed. For several tense minutes, they remained in that narrow space between action and consequence. Then a second ship reduced speed. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but just enough to break the rhythm. The effect was immediate. Gaps opened in the formation. Bearings began to drift apart. What had looked like coordinated pressure now carried the appearance of uncertainty. The carrier never altered course. The helicopter completed another smooth pass, its markings clearly visible. No weapons displayed, no aggressive posture, just a controlled, undeniable presence. By 3:40 p.m., the outcome was clear. The Venezuelan ships were still nearby, still visible against the horizon, but they were no longer closing in. One by one, they widened their paths, increasing distance under the appearance of routine navigation. No shots were fired, no voices were raised, yet the encounter had reached its conclusion. In modern naval operations, dominance is not always about force applied. Often it is about force deliberately held back at the right moment, for the right reasons. What the Venezuelan commanders had intended as pressure became exposure. What they expected to trigger a response instead revealed clarity. They did not meet aggression. They met control. By 3:45 p.m., the geometry of the situation had changed completely. All 7 ships remained on radar and visible across the calm Caribbean horizon, but the moment itself had passed. Their formation no longer suggested intent. Speeds returned to normal, courses diverged. What began as coordinated movement quietly dissolved into separate navigation decisions. From a distance, it might have looked like nothing happened. From a strategic perspective, everything had. The Venezuelan commanders made a key miscalculation, one that modern naval doctrine consistently punishes. They assumed that closing distance creates leverage. In reality, closing distance without the ability to escalate creates vulnerability. The closer they came, the more information they revealed. Engine behavior, command timing, crew reactions, decision speed, all of it was observed, recorded, and categorized. And none of it worked in their favor. On the American side, the response was almost invisible to anyone not directly involved. No public warnings, no dramatic displays, no sudden shifts that could be interpreted as provocation. Instead, the carrier maintained discipline and allowed the situation to define itself. The discipline removed what the Venezuelan side needed most: control over the narrative. Gray zone tactics rely on reaction. They depend on forcing the opponent into a visible choice, to turn away, to escalate, or to explain. The carrier did none of these. By holding course and remaining silent, it removed the emotional element entirely. The pressure applied by the Venezuelan ships had nowhere to land, and pressure without response eventually collapses. Just as important, the carrier never placed itself in a position where escalation was required. No targeting systems activated, no weapons were directed, no actions were taken that could justify a countermeasure. The Venezuelan commanders found themselves constrained by their own caution. Moving forward carried risk. Pulling away risked embarrassment. Holding position only prolonged exposure. At that point, the mistake could no longer be undone. In modern maritime operations, information is power. The helicopter's recordings, optical, infrared, and positional, were not just tactical tools. They were also legal records. Every movement made by the Venezuelan ships was preserved in high detail. If questions were ever raised, the timeline would be clear. Who approached, who maneuvered, and who remained steady. The carrier did not need to say anything. The data would speak. For Venezuela, the implications extended beyond this single moment. Naval signaling builds over time, each action shaping expectations for the next. By committing multiple ships to a maneuver that produced no reaction, no concession, and no advantage, they revealed a gap between intention and execution. They showed coordination, but also hesitation. Presence, but not control. Meanwhile, the carrier continued on its original path, unchanged. That consistency mattered. It reinforced a core principle of U.S. naval operations. Freedom of navigation is not negotiated in the moment. It is exercised calmly, consistently, and without unnecessary attention. As the distance increased, the helicopter returned to the deck. Systems were secured. Logs were completed. What had unfolded over roughly half an hour would now exist as data, analyzed, archived, and used to inform future operations. There would be no headlines, no public recognition. But the lesson was clear. The Venezuelan ships had attempted to project influence through numbers and proximity. They underestimated the impact of restraint. They misread the environment, one where visibility favors preparation and where silence can carry more weight than force. They did not encounter resistance. They encountered inevitability. And in doing so, they learned the difference between approaching a target and engaging with a system designed to let others reveal their own missteps, one quiet decision at a time. By 4:10 p.m., the Caribbean had returned to its earlier calm. The Venezuelan ships remained on radar, now at safe distances, moving along separate paths that posed no risk and applied no pressure. The American carrier continued its transit exactly as planned. Same speed, same course, same mission. To an outside observer, the entire situation might have looked uneventful, and that was exactly the point. Nothing dramatic happened because the system did exactly what it was designed to do. In naval operations, the most dangerous moments are often the quiet ones, when pride, miscalculation, or impatience can turn simple proximity into something far more serious. What prevented that outcome here wasn't overwhelming force, but disciplined control. The carrier never had to prove what it was capable of because its capability was never in doubt. Every stage of the encounter reinforced that. The Venezuelan ships approached with numbers, coordination, and clear intent. But intent alone doesn't create leverage. Without the authority to escalate, without legal justification, and without control over how the situation is perceived, pressure begins to work against the side applying it. The longer they stay close, the more they expose themselves to observation, documentation, and later analysis. This is exactly how modern gray zone operations work. They rely on ambiguity and subtle pressure, staying below the threshold of open conflict while still trying to influence outcomes. But when that pressure is met with discipline instead of reaction, the advantage can quickly disappear. For the U.S. Navy, restraint wasn't a limitation. It was a deliberate operational decision, shaped by decades of doctrine and experience. The crew understood that reacting emotionally would only shift the initiative to the other side. Instead, they allowed time, positioning, and professionalism to take control of the situation. And that discipline extended far beyond what was visible. The data collected during the encounter, radar tracks, infrared imagery, maneuver logs, was already being processed. Analysts would compare patterns, study timing, evaluate responses. This kind of information rarely makes headlines, but it influences future decisions in ways that matter far more. Encounters like this don't really end when ships separate. They carry forward. For Venezuela, the message was subtle but unmistakable. Approaching a U.S. aircraft carrier without the ability or intention to escalate doesn't force a reaction. It invites scrutiny, it creates a record, and it reduces future flexibility. The cost wasn't immediate embarrassment or confrontation, it was predictability. The encounter reinforced a key principle. Freedom of navigation isn't something that needs to be proven with force every time. It's maintained through consistency. By continuing its course without interruption, the carrier upheld that principle without a single dramatic move. That balance matters. In today's environment, naval encounters are becoming more frequent and more sensitive. The margin for error is small. Every close approach carries the risk of misunderstanding. Every aggressive move can trigger a chain of decisions that can't easily be undone. The ability to prevent escalation, to let a tense moment fade without spectacle, isn't passive. It's a skill. And in many cases, it's one of the most effective tools available. As the carrier moved beyond the last radar contact, the event was simply logged and closed out. No emergency messages, no incident reports, just a detailed account of what happened and how it was handled. 7 warships attempted to apply pressure. One carrier just kept moving. That outcome wasn't accidental. It was the result of a system built to absorb challenges without reacting impulsively, to control the environment without needing attention. So the real takeaway from that afternoon isn't about who turned away first, it's about who never had to. Because in modern naval operations, the side that remains calm, stays within the rules, and maintains consistency often gains the advantage long before any direct confrontation becomes possible. And sometimes the most decisive outcome at sea is the one that looks, from the outside, like nothing happened at all.